Good morning. We are rather early. Maybe we're going to be a bit more earlier in the continuation. But the morning sun shines heavily upon us. It's a very nice late August summer's day, oddly enough. Not very common in Sweden to have this warmth. Temperatures would be reaching up to 21, 22 degrees today. And I'm standing here in the sun, feeling great. I will continue a little bit about this very interesting article by Stephen M Rosen. Actually, it's an excerpt from his book Dimensions of Apeiron, a topological phenomenology of space, time and individuation. And I'm happy to say that we are now in contact with Stephen M Rosen, which I'm very happy for. Goes to show it's a good idea to thank article authors when you download at some other academic sites like JPEG and so forth. I always written that I love his writings, and if I can use them as reference in my lectures and so forth. Last time I mentioned the discovery of discontinuity that led to the crisis of the early 20th century, and that was indeed a massive crisis, might be one of the biggest ones. The old idea that space and time was indefinitely divisible fell in one single stroke, like this. And this is what had been presumed in all thinking, and I would say even more so outside physics. This is the foundation of all thinking whatsoever, and the idea of space as being something continuous and divisible, which makes for all things that we mentioned before, subject in front of object in space. I now continue for the page here, taking collectively these cultural discontinuities. The continuities are the fragmentization of space and time itself. These constitute the crisis of postmodernity. Just what happened to precipitate the dilemma? Was it a particular event? Was it a set of events occurring in a certain place at a certain time that led us to this pass? Well, what changed was our experience of space and time themselves. Something very often neglected, but decisive in how we form our life world. Decisive when it comes to what we feel exists and doesn't exist. Decisive even how we move, walk and balance ourselves. All those things are dependent on our foundational perception of space and time. I would say especially the pre-reflective experience. And we all know experience can never ever be challenged by argument, because experience is what is founding. It's in the bottom, before argument, before reflection. And what happened was some feature of reality that was left completely outside the domain of argument, ideology, philosophy, religion, personal stances, opinions, were calling the shots. And then it might not be very hard to understand how big an effect this was. Some people, like Spengler, has even theorized that it led to the Second World War. I can well imagine. The disaster is quite incredible. Well, assuming the mid-19th century unsettlement of classical space and time has in fact contributed to our current state of turmoil in a significant way. How can we better understand it? I suggest that the 19th century watershed betokened the reappearance of an old nemesis. Western culture was forged from the struggle of human reason with the irrational forces of nature. To early Greek, science and philosophy, nature in the wild is apeiron. This is the Greek word for what is limitless, boundless, indeterminate. The apeiron is variously interpreted as the unintelligible, the many, the moving, the ugly, the bad. Might I add, the up and the down, death and life, dream and awake, and men and slaves. The in-choate flux of opposites or contraries, the principle of disorder or disharmony. We managed to help or hold apeiron at bay for more than 2,000 years, and it has now returned with a vengeance. This, I suggest, is the dilemma that underlies postmodernity. The disruption of space and time, along with it all of the points of reference used by individuals and groups in the past to plot their life courses. It is pretty amazing, actually. Every single individual before could be sure that time will sort of pass in a certain way, that they could be sure of space, and then everything was taken away from them, but from underneath, from a point of view they had no control over. Makes all sense to me somehow. All we have gained seems threatened. All seems on the verge of being lost. But appearances can be deceiving. What I propose is the upsurgence of basic indeterminacy or uncertainty. According to the well-known uncertainty principle postulated by Werner Heisenberg in 1927, there is a built-in limit to the information we can obtain about the physical properties of quantum systems. This limitation can be stated in the terms of Planck constant, where P and Q are variables such as position and momentum, or time and energy. Variables that are paired or conjugated so as to be essentially indivisible from each other. The formula says that the product of uncertainties of such paired terms approximately equals, cannot be less than, the value of Planck's constants. Clearly then, the phasic indivisibility of Planck level action is equivalent to uncertainty. So uncertainty, seen from the all point of view, is built into the universe. There is no argument that can change that. There is nothing we can do about it. No wonder 19th, 20th century human beings felt it lost and went into spiraling down. In a way, there were no longer any idea or need for planning. We couldn't agree upon things because there was no longer any stable foundation. We could no longer sort of understand a proper up or a proper down. No longer did we have left or right. There's another way to look at the quantum uncertainty. Nearing the submicroscopic Planck length, it appears that precise objective measurement is thwarted by the fact that the energy that must be transferred to a system in order to observe it disturbs that system significantly. This well-known problem of measurement in quantum mechanics expresses quantum indivisibility in terms of the indivisibility of the observer and the observed. And here we come to an interesting point. Before, in the classical model, the observer and the observed were always disjunct, no exception. That has actually been the case since the bifurcation, the dividing line started among the Milesian philosophers of nature. It seems that in quantum mechanics, the observer no longer can maintain the classical posture of detached objectivity. Unavoidably, he will be an active participant. Evidently, this means that quantum mechanical action cannot be regarded merely as objective, but must be seen as entailing the intimate blending of subject and object. The ultramicroscopic research on light at bottom seems to suggest that when we move down the scale of magnitude to the Planckian threshold, the spatial container becomes leaky. The spatial container is actually the receptacle of Plato, or the space as we mean when we spoke Newtonian physics. It becomes leaky. It loses its continuity, and all of a sudden the apeiron resurfaces. Why? Well, we no longer have continuum, and space itself is leaky. Why? Well, if we have the smallest amount of space to be the Planck constant, we no longer have a canvas to put the things into. Things and canvas becomes indivisible. We can no longer separate them. We can no longer have things in space in that old way. They become connected. I would say they become entangled in a very precise way. Needs for a cup of coffee. The classical expectation, rooted in the assumption of continuity, is the scale shrinkage, and that will eventually bring us to the null volume of the dimensionless space, or the dimensionless point. Once more, we have the singularity of the particle, the dimensionless point-like particle. And I think there is an obsession with these days, just because of this collapse of the regular thinking. At this level of nature, all material bodies lose their extension and vanish. As a consequence, space becomes vacuous and cold, devoid of energy or matter. Quantum mechanics presents a dramatically different picture of microphysical reality. Instead of energetic nature being totally subdued, she returns with a vengeance. As the philosopher-physicist David Bohm puts it, in classical physics, quote, "The field changes over very short distances are negligibly small, whereas in the quantum theory, the shorter the distances one consider, the more violent are the quantum fluctuation associated with the 0-point energy of the vacuum. In these fluctuations, are so large that the assumption that the field operators are continuous functions of positions is not valid in a strict sense. Sorry about the disturbance. Can you hear me, Kalle? Okay. I will shout for a bit now. This will only continue for 5 minutes. The vacuum fluctuations that disrupt classical continuity are of course associated with Planck's constant, which embodies the indivisibility of action, irreducibly uncertainty, and the inseparability of subject and object. This wild variability in nature in the small is reminiscent of the irrational motion, the fleeting potencies and constantly changing tensions of Plato's tenuously continuous receptacle. So one could say this is the death of the receptacle. And I would also like to compare this to the butterfly effect, because the smaller you go down into scale, the more violent are the changes. It's just the opposite from the classical mode, where if you go upscale, if you have a big machine like this one, then you get differences. But if you have a grain of sand, you don't get much difference. This is not true. This is also vaguely reminiscent of scale independency. With the Renaissance, Platonic proto-space was superseded by a new order of space, one whose continuity was enhanced. It was this order that was called into question by Planck's black body research. Did Planck and his successor actually accept the discontinuity? Did quantum physics give up Einstein's effort to uphold objectivism? Did it embrace the indivisibility of object and subject that betokens apeiron? The 19th century threat of discontinuity and concomitant loss of objectivity constituted nothing less than a threat to the life of the cogito, Descartes' term for the thinking subject. The cogito is dependent on the res extensa. Without the res extensa, we cannot have cogito and vice versa. They are codependent. And when res extensa falls, so does cogito. We can no longer think about thinking mind without extension, without materiality, and all those features. To accept apeiron would be to accept the collapse of the projection upon which human identity had come to depend. It is therefore no surprise that Planck could accept apeiron no better than Einstein. The fact is that quantum mechanics did not simply give up on the continuum. Instead, implicitly, the attempt was made to retain spatial continuity through an approach that is even more abstract than Einstein. And when I say spatial, I mean spatial. I'm not 100% sure how to pronounce it in English. But it's important that we make a distinction between spatial with a T and spatial, that is more to do with the room. Yeah, it comes back with a vengeance. Now it's getting interesting. String theory and apeiron. Among the latest efforts to sidestep apeiron is a theory that has attracted widespread interest in the scientific community and beyond, the string theory. The basic idea is what we can't know can't hurt us. That is, if it's impossible for us to prove the cataclysmic energies allegedly prevailing below the Planck length, then we are entitled to assume that said energies either actually do not exist, or that they exist but cannot influence us, and therefore can be completely disregarded. The physicist Brian Greene, whom we know, the one who made the free episode of Quantum Mechanics, in his attempt to explain how string theory calms the violent quantum jitters, tames the sub-Planck length quantum ondulation of space, acknowledges the positive nature of his strategy. A positive would say that something exists only if it can, at least in principle, be proved and measured, end of quote. Because the violent sub-Planck length fluctuations cannot be measured. According to string theory, they do not actually arise, end of quote. Strings are tiny, one-dimensional filaments, somewhat like infinitely thin rubber bands, vibrating to and through. How long is a string? It is roughly the size of the Planck length, very small. By supposing the string to be the very basic constituent of nature, string theory precludes any movement below the Planck length, in the chaotic realm where infinities would arise to shatter the continuum. How very clever. Greene poses the questions, what are strings made of? And the answer it as follows. Strings are truly fundamentals. They are atoms, uncuttable constituents, in the truest sense of the ancient Greeks, the Milesians, as the absolute smallest constituents of anything and everything. They represent the end of the line. From this perspective, even though strings have spatial extent, the question of the composition is without any content. Is there no contradiction here? Does the notion of a fundamental particle with finite extension really make any sense? For to be spatially extended is to be cuttable. You can divide it. In fact, infinitely divisible. How then could a string be a fundamental particle, an indivisible ingredient of nature, when it is spatially extended? Think of that. How can it be spatial when you cannot cut it? Doesn't make any sense. Perhaps when Greene speaks of the strings as he does, he has some unusual definition of spatial extension in mind. If that is the case, we are given no hint of it. Consequently, we are left with the default meaning of extension. The classical intuition of it that entails the idea of being divisible. The string then is an indivisible particle that is divisible, a contradiction to be sure. What the contradiction at the heart of string theory discloses is that in the final analysis, apeiron, the in-choked flux of contraries, cannot be denied. Does this preordain a simple regression into chaos? I suggest it does not. I propose that the apparent self-contradiction of string theory in fact might entail a certain dialectic of transformation. It is clear by now that the apeiron had never been truly eliminated in the cogito striving for individuation. Instead, the chaotic element in nature merely had been relegated to the background via the idealization of science. In the contradiction of string theory, apeiron now enters the foreground in an irrepressible way. Yet I submit that the attendant threat of wholesale regression lies not so much in the apeiron per se, but in the continuing attempt to deny her. So what do we have? We have an ongoing fear of the apeiron. And Brian Greene and the string theorist, according to Stephen M Rosen, they try to avoid the danger before they get there. They are not willing to face the threat of the apeiron, the unboundedness. Instead, before the fact, before it happens, they go into emergency action and say that the string is the fundamental RK, although it doesn't have an extension. It is in the resisting what actually can be resisted no longer. That catastrophe threatens. The ongoing resistance is certainly understandable. To the cogito who clings to this detached stance, apeiron, now this is good, apeiron can only signify the complete loss of individuality. But it is surely not the case that the cogito had ever fully achieved individuality, because his idealized projections to the contrary notwithstanding, just as Descartes said that the mind equals what he perceives, it is actually reduction of the cogito. I propose that it is precisely when apeiron is accepted, when it is accepted, that the process of individuation can be completed in earnest. By no means does such an acceptance involve passively resigning oneself to dissolution in the chaotic multiplicity of apeiron. No, no. It turns out that one can actively participate in the many of apeiron without losing oneness. And that, in fact, oneness, unity, individuality can genuinely be achieved only through said participation. And I put in a parenthesis, here he parallels completely Heraclitus and the voice of the friend. We can actively participate in the many of apeiron without losing oneness. The many and the one, the whole and the unwhole, unholon, holon ke unholon. They go together, and they need to go together. What is called for here is the dialectic of the one and many that favors neither the unity of fixed form nor formless multiplicity. A dialectic of transformation is required. Were this approach to be taken to string theory, an acceptable contradiction could become a fruitful paradox. I attempted such a dialectic reformulation of the dimensional underpinnings of the theory. Carrying this out effectively involves nothing less than a radical transformation of the foundations of science, specifically the Baconian enterprise of subduing Mother Nature, imposing unity upon her from afar, from a distance, is supplanted by an endeavor in which we seek to understand nature from within, by participating freely in her flowing diversity. A good indication of this is given in the Nobel Prize winning work of biologist Barbara McClintock. In marked contrast to the detached, dispassionate attitude of the Cartesian scientist, McClintock immerses herself in the natural world, gaining an intimate feeling for the plants that she studies. Evelyn Fox Kellers referred to McClintock's uniquely empathetic scientific orientation as allocentric perception, or more plainly put as love. According to Keller, McClintock can risk the suspension of boundaries between subject and object without jeopardy to science, precisely because, to her, science is not premised on that division. Indeed, the intimacy she experiences with the object she studies is a wellspring of her powers as a scientist. In this world of difference, division is relinquished without generating chaos. Self and other, mind and nature survive not in mutual alienation or in symbolic fusion, but in structural integrity. End of quote. In such a dialectical rendering of science, while unity does not simply dissolve, neither does it prevail in the one-sided terms of the alienated cogito. Instead, there is a unity in diversity, a diversity in unity. And I would say that is also the voice of the many that doesn't exclude singularity, and it enforces singularity. Strictly black holes and apeiron. Strictly conceived, a black hole is an astrophysical phenomenon, but I suggest we can view it in both in the literal terms of physics and as a metaphor for the contemporary implosion of psyche and society. A black hole is a cool phenomenon, as media theorist Marshall McLuhan would say. It is the implosion that follows the explosive phase of a star's history, when the impetus heat of its youth has given way to more sober gravitational concerns. Speaking in broader culture terms, McLuhan is telling us that it is the human ego that has imploded. Since the end of World War II, the limitations of the ego have certainly become more difficult to deny, and human experience had changed accordingly. Yet, if phenomena like pop art, the anti-hero, the rap express a new mode of iconoclasm that reflects the ego's recognition of its own finitude, the whole at its center, at the very same time, the ego also still seeks coolly to deny that whole. This sums up the essence of our postmodern age, an implicit recognition of our emptiness that simultaneously strives to deny it. How aptly put. How aptly put.
So far, if I understood Rosen correctly, he says or implies that the apeiron, the indefinite of Anaximander, is synonymous with the black hole.
In a way, yeah, it's continuing. It's coming into very well.
Okay, so far.
Very good, Kalle. Yes, yes. How excellently put, Kalle. So we try to deny it, we try to take away what we think is the death of emptiness. And I think about that movie, was Poltergeist by Steven Spielberg, where they scream to little Carrie, don't go into the light. But it is still in the light that all calmness, divineness, unity lies. And the reason they said so to her was that they didn't want her to go into the unity yet. And I like this neck dress. I started to like Rosen more and more. He says, yet playing it cool. We try to ignore the scare and we make fun of it, like they made fun of Paul Old Brewer in the United States in the mid-war. Whereas I have friends who said, take a glass and said life is hopeless or something like that, trying to play cool, but when they sleep, and I know that, they are haunted by nightmares. And usually in their morning hours they try to get over the anxiety. And that's playing it cool. And I think most people do that. I think there are some exceptions that we should look out for. Carl Sagan was definitely one of those. He didn't try to play cool, yeah?
As I was thinking, there's this famous phrase, horror vacui,
Yes.
of Greeks. So that is, the Greeks were afraid of empty space. Okay, we know that.
Yeah.
And let's imagine back without this package that we have of understanding. So when Thales said that everything is water, and then you have this apeiron instead as the source, it must have been a shock to the Greeks.
Oh yeah.
Because it's completely like a shock effect, like like throwing something in your face.
Yeah.
Okay, so first comes Thales with water, and then you have Anaximander who says apeiron. That's like a shock. And then Heracles makes his own variant with fire, which also has his shock effect.
Yeah.
It's like a variant of our black hole.
Yeah.
Because we get uneasy with the black hole, like our certain.
And I have to say, all physicists until recently got really uneasy, and this was the scare of Einstein. He actually thought of the black hole, but the black hole would destroy all of his theory, and he had nightmares about it, literally, because in the fourth dimension, you see, space and time in the black hole, they collapse into singularity, and that negates his whole theory.
If I can show you, I would compare black hole to this so-called throat, if you compare it with human anatomy, because it's, how would I put it? I lost my thread, but
yeah, I think I know what you mean, but I can't express it either.
So the apeiron is like this throat that is. Let me think about this.
Yeah, we can get back to the Klein bottle won't disappear.
Let me think. Anyhow, so no, the black hole is like the hole that is with the four letters hole. Not whole with the W.
No.
It's something we don't really understand the throat. It doesn't really serve a purpose, seemingly. In one way, it's like the black hole. Because yes, now I know it. Throat doesn't really have an opening. It's neither inside or outside. In one way, at least in this variant. Do you see?
Yeah.
You see, it's both outside and inside.
Inside, definitely. And this actually goes for a black hole as well.
Yes.
Very well. Yeah, you outplayed the black hole because it's coming now here. Very good, Kalle. Yet playing it cool, we then nevertheless continue our denial, but now in such a way that its very quality of ineffectual repetition actually accentuates the gnawing emptiness at the core of us. I think that is very true. The black hole is indeed a cool phenomenon, at least when viewed from the outside, that is, from the standpoint of the life of the star, whose extroverted energies have now dissipated. Black hole is a dead star usually. We know, however, that the interior of the hole is hardly lacking in energy, albeit of an introverted, implosive sort. The further we go into the heart of the black hole, the greater this crush of gravity becomes, until a marked turbulence sets in. The dynamic flux in question is not that of an event taking place in space and time. Rather, it is the flux of space and time themselves. What this means is that spatiotemporal discontinuity attends the movement to the single core of the black hole, as indeed it does with the movement below the Planck length. Concomitantly, there is ambiguity, all-pervasive uncertainty. When the core is finally reached, the chaos can no longer be contained. The infinite gravitational energy confronted at the center of the black hole is, of course, the energy of apeiron. It's apeiron that the ego confronts with the postmodern implosion of Western culture, and apeiron that it seeks most desperately to deny. Long has this black goddess been repressed, for she threatens the very life of the rational being. The existence of Homo rationalis is predicted on an assumption that itself has been obscured for centuries, millennia. Never enunciated but always taken for granted is the supposition that man has contained Mother Nature and now stands free and clear of her. In this posture of detachment and power of containment that most essentially defines the individual, he maintains himself as an individual, as he who is one, undivided, unitary, by containing her. At bottom, that is what science's quest for unity has all been about. Plato's leaky vessel had been a tentative step toward containment. Descartes and Newton did far better. With them, apeiron was so well bottled up that there was not so much as a hint of her. But then, in the middle of the 19th century, just when the work of science seemed on the verge of completion, just when Mother Nature was to be fully contained, once and for all, like in the words of Lord Kelvin, now it's just one decimal left, then we have contained her. The container gave evidence of fissures. For 100 years thereafter, we did our modernist best to plug the leaks, to keep the genie in the bottle, until the fateful morning of 6th of August 1945. That morning, more than any other, with its frightful unleashing of a mushroom-shaped chaos, perhaps best symbolizes the failure of containment. Yet this flattening out of an entire city was only the beginning of the end. For the thermonuclear outpouring of energy, in fact, was contained, limited as it was to a relatively small geographical area. The tidal wave of energy set free by opening up the atom is but a droplet in the ocean of energy that seethes beneath the subatomic limit of the microworld, beneath the Planck length. This is the zero-point energy, the energy of the black hole, the unbridled fury of the black goddess. If that energy was set loose, the container would be exploded, what would not be confinable to a region of space, since it would be space itself that would explode. Where then would the energy go? Of her sheer desperation, that accompanies my ongoing crash into groundlessness, and urgently felt compulsion to find something, anything, to hang on to. When this happens, every instinct tells me to break the fall, to reach for something overhanging ledge and cling to it for dear life. But that would not amount to still another effort at denying apeiron. It seems that some existential skydiving is in order. In aiming to surpass modernism and postmodernity alike, we must stay in free fall, however perilous that may appear to panicky cogitator like myself. The pull of gravity surely is strong. It's an impulse that no ground can stop, since what draws us in is the black hole. Yet, despite our grave trepidations, it seems we must find a way to accept the dark chaos of apeiron. The text, the I persona and the apeiron. In what specific way would our apprehension of this text have to change in order that we consciously engage apeiron here and now? Yes, it is generally true that to reach the apeironic ground of these words, the master word, the I that centers all our thinking, must itself be apprehended. Relevant in this regard is David Bohm's call for the proprioception of thought, which he saw as a certain kind of meditative act wherein consciousness becomes aware of its own implicate activity, in which its content originates, is going to the pre-reflective, so to speak. What I would now add to what I said about this in the previous chapter is that such a reversal of thinking's gear would have to be grounded in the body. But can anything more be said about just how we are to enter the body? In Eugene Gendlin's experiential approach, we advise to enter the body through the middle. Let your attention refer inside, directly, physically, to the comfort or discomfort in the middle of your body, say in your chest or stomach. This parallels exactly the chapters we mentioned before, just before the lecture, that Ian McGilchrist wrote in The Master and His Emissary, where he showed how the reflection started, the rise of the ego, the change of the language of the Greeks, the break from the old traditional way where the consciousness was situated in the body and where it's still situated in Eastern cultures. The move to the head, or the move completely away from the body, this disembodied thinking, is what it's threatened. The disembodiedness is threatened here. The alternative I suggest, so as to facilitate the proprioception of the thinking body that governs this ontological writing, is that we enter the body through the head. My proposal is based on the work of the American social psychiatrist Trigant Borrow. I noted years before Bohm, Borrow had spoken of the need for human beings to gain proprioceptive awareness of the organismic basis of thinking and language, these being the activities Borrow deemed responsible for the fragmentation of human society. Borrow's term for the I, anonymously engaged in ceaseless objectification, is the I persona. Importantly, the functioning of the I persona has a distinct anatomical locus. It is centered in what Borrow calls the cerebro-ocular region, that is, in the cerebral cortex of the brain and in the organ of vision associated with it. Borrow pointed out that it was through the phylogenetic development of the cerebral cortex that language and symbolic activity first arose. Therefore, to gain an immediate sense of this activity, it seems one had to enter the body through the cerebrum. But this conclusion was informed by more than a simple logical deduction. Borrow claimed to have had a spontaneous experience of the I persona's bodily base, one that profoundly influenced all his subsequent research. After a prolonged period of interpersonal strife involving the members of the group that he had established to investigate such I-based conflicts, he began to notice a distinct pattern of tension around his eyes and forehead. Borrow recognized in this the concrete expression of the I persona. From the Borrowian perspective, then, the proprioception in which we must engage to make tangible contact with the grounding of this text entails bringing attention to the oculofacial or cephalic segment, that is, to the area of the sheer desperation. Oh, sorry. The area around the body and around the forehead and eyes. Borrow would caution us not to confuse the I persona that resides therein with the ego of the allegedly isolated individual. We might say that this persona is the species-wide subject that lies behind the appearance of individual subjectivity. But while it is through the I persona that we, as species, create the impression of ourselves as merely isolated, disembodied subjects, the generic I itself is no disembodied subject. Instead, it is the bodily process that is central to human functioning as a whole. Therefore, when Borrow became attentive to the I persona, rather than continuing to be unwittingly governed by it, he experienced this palpable pattern of tension around the eyes and forehead against the tensional pattern of the organism as whole. He was thus presumably able to apprehend in an immediate way what he called the solidarity of the species, what Merleau-Ponty called the flesh of the world, what we have called the apeiron. How interesting. Never heard about this. Borrow. Following his first spontaneous proprioception of the generic organism, Borrow sought to cultivate the experience in a systematic practice he named contention. He described his procedures as one of setting aside daily experimental periods in which he adhered consistently to relaxing the eyes and to getting the kinesthetic feel of the tension in and about the eyes, and in the cephalic area generally. Burroughs might say that behind my work with this text, behind my typing of these very words, the master word or I persona operates, and that this generic I manifests itself concretely in the muscular activity of my eyes. It may well be easier to proprioceptive movement in other parts of the body than the eyes, since ocular activity is subtler. A great deal more practice may be necessary. Nevertheless, if Burroughs is right, it is proprioception of the activity in and around my eyes that would be required for generic proprioception. So it seems that if I am to go beyond functioning exclusively as an abstract head, or the head of Searle in a vat, or the consciousness of Descartes flying about, so it seems that if I am going to go beyond function exclusively as this disembodied head, my practice evidently would have to include obtaining a bodily sense of the very head that now directs the writing, to feel the head as a piece of the body, and the eye specifically. As I write these words, then, I am to turn my awareness to the tensions in my eyes, behind which lies the master word, the I. And this is oddly very close to both Richard E. Lind and Ian McGilchrist, because he focuses especially on the change of the verbs for seeing, because they changes the most dramatically if you compare the Odyssey and the Iliad to the pre-Socratic and further, because especially in those, all of a sudden we see something which is really odd. This is not how you express yourself in other languages, that you see something. It's the seeing as an activity that is depicted in other language, like Hopi language. And seeing something get rid of the most important, and that is the seeing itself, the quality of the seeing. And since there are many words in the Odyssey and the Iliad for seeing, those disappear later because of this. And I think in Swedish we have only 2 or 3 different words. I think Hopi has 500. Individuation and apeiron. In this work I have sought to explore at its root the fragmentation of human culture, so pervasive at this juncture of our history. I began by reading the litany of woes currently besetting humankind. These problems are all well too known, and I will not repeat my recitation of them here. In summing up, what I want to reiterate is what I believe to be the crux of our dilemma, and the sea change in human functioning that is needed to address it. Why is that, despite the good intentions of great many highly intelligent, talented, and inventive individuals throughout the world, our problems only seem to be increasing, and in fact appear to be rapidly reaching ominous proportions? I propose it is essentially because, however well-meaning we have been, what we have never fully questioned is this very we. The I point is never coming into question. Well, it's obvious because it doesn't exist in the Newtonian Descartesian world, or the Platonian for that is. That is, in our valiant efforts to remedy our grave situation by achieving an insight into it, we have failed to gain sufficient insight into the prime players in the drama, ourselves. But haven't the more reflective members of our species been searching their souls from time immemorial. It is indeed true that ever since the rise of reflective consciousness, we have been seeking to know ourselves, as Socrates exhorted. Over 2,000 years. That is what our quest for individuation has been all about. What I'm suggesting, however, is that this quest have always been frustrated because human reflectivity has always been geared to turn whatever it seeks to know into an object, including itself. In this way, it has alienated itself, even as it has striven for self-intimacy. It is our self-alienation, then, I submit, that has brought us to the brink of catastrophe. In the present work, I have proposed that self-knowledge required for grasping the true nature of our predicament demands that we take an unprecedented step, or maybe a quantum leap, I would suggest. We must effect a radical reversal of gears. The reflective individual must break the centuries-old habit of moving away from himself toward his object, must move back into himself to the pre-reflective source of his reflection. There he will find that he is not merely a freestanding subject after all, nor is he merely an object. Instead, he is the embodied fusion of subject and object that constitute the paradox of the apeiron. And here it can be seen, this is important at this stage, to actually show how subject and object literally in space are connected. This is the uncontained subject going down into the contained space, which is the object. And in this process, there is a containing space, which is the open space that has been by the pre-Socratic negated or reducted heavily into nothingness, without properties, without wholes. So we no longer can understand a very big portion of our reality, because in the regular model with 3 dimensions, all this is blank, it's empty, it doesn't have any properties at all, it's propertyless, it doesn't have any holes, it doesn't have any throws or hills. And in that meaningless, we see that as what we think is the unknown. And of course we get scared. But we don't know this is an invention of human mind. It came in a culture where people were beset by water and therefore assumed space itself is without properties. And that taken, if we think apeiron is that, no wonder we get absolutely scared. And it's so interesting that there's a sturdy scientific proof for that. People who strived in the area of Milgram have today shown that people do no longer have an alternative worldview. Nobody longer truly believe in any other thing than postmodernity. They all give up now. They all push the button to kill off the poor guinea pig. And this shows that humanity has lost its morality, not because we become demoralized, but rather because it is now literally, I don't say it is potentially, I would say it's literally impossible to understand higher things. because we are so fixated in escaping. So even the ones who's proposing there are higher values are scared incredibly high. This is something a person called Michael Person showed, that people high up in the religious hierarchy are dead scared of death these days. Their death turmoil is horrendous. Horrendous. And all the results from Libet also show that the actual soul is gone now. The I persona automatically chooses for us. Our body, the decisive power, never ever comes into the action. We have, because of the space we have sort of embodied now, getting rid of the body and no longer seeing the thinking process as embodiment. I think that is what he's pointing to. Borrow says these are no longer things that are body-like, and therefore of course we lose our control of them. So we lose in both ends. I would say we lose the properties of the containing space and we lose the subject. We are no longer individuals because it's proven we have no longer a free will. No one no longer believes that the subject has a continuance, permanence, not even over days. This is echoing the words of Camus, of course, especially in his books that he writes about human suffering and how terrible it is to exist. I think he tries to be a good chap with it, and he drowns his sorrow with a glass of wine. But I would say there is no need for it. By showing, and you can touch it, you can understand what space really is. This is the true face of space. And although I'm looking outside of it, I can embody it, because this is the body of knowledge. This is the true face of me. And herein lies individuality. And it's an individuality that doesn't have to be afraid constantly. The angst can disappear. And that has two great benefits to it. First, we get rid of the angst. But the second, I would say, is even greater. We become individuals. We become, as Arthur Koestler wanted us to be, souls. He wrote about the search for meaning after being, I think, in a concentration camp, that we must make life meaningful and we must regard other people as souls. But when I read his books, I understood what he meant, and I also understand it would be a good thing to see people as living souls instead of material objects like Daniel Dennett or any other one for that matter. I think most people see it that way. But this shows that the subject is participating in matter, in space at every time. And I think that is what was needed for Arthur Koestler and for Viktor Frankl for that matter too. I think meaning is inbuilt in the system. We couldn't get rid of it even if we wanted to.
Can I return to the previous subject of black holes?
Of course.
Okay, thank you. So we have in the 1920s the discovery of quantum physics was like a shock, as we know.
Oof, more than a shock. My God, it destroyed civilization. Small shock.
So thanks.
Good, Kalle.
But thanks to Rosen's paper, I think also the apeiron must have been a shock. Since it's hard. Before this lecture today, I was thinking a little vaguely. It's something like air or something. It is something vague that is floating. But now it's something. It must be something. We have spoken earlier. If, so to say, the pre-Socratics foresaw some insights of the quantum physics by their since. They looked into the nature, like Heraclitus. He could have foresaw some of the insights for quantum physics. Similarly, Anaximander, when he spoke about apeiron, he he felt perhaps he was still in some way in the nature. He felt perhaps that black hole, if he had perhaps some knowledge of it intuitively, so to say.
Oh yeah, yeah, definitely had an intuitive.
And as I said earlier, perhaps the black hole is some way like the throat. So in what way is the black hole like a throat of this vase? It should be empty in a relative sense. You shouldn't keep the food there. You cannot keep the food there. And you, Hans, you know better than I about black holes. So if you compare the human throat to black holes, do you see anything more? Do you see something in common?
Yeah, I would say that I was thinking of Francisco Varela and Hugo Umberto Maturana once more. And it's the development of the gastrointestinal tract that makes the first living mononucleus living organism able to orientate themselves. For them, they have an up, they have an down. This is the start of a boundary and orientation. As you can see here, this is space. That means in the regular space there is no true orientation. What did we have before this horrible catastrophe of the ultraviolet catastrophe? I think we might have some intuitive that shared by everyone, but it wasn't on good grounds because it shattered. But it worked to some extent, as long as no one had another view, or very, very few, I would say. But when this news crashed over all papers all over the world, this is what happened. Every newspaper, even the newspaper on my grandfather's, had an article of quantum mechanics. It caused such a tremor all over the world, and then it disappeared all over the world. And I don't think that, some people said that must be a conspiracy. And I say, hey, how would it be that the newspaper in the small village of my hometown didn't publish anything more? So did all small villages in Canada, British India, you name it. It all disappeared. The fear of the apeiron. We wanted to keep the little we had, as we thought we could keep it. And this is also what Jordan Peterson and David Pinker is trying to reconstitute somehow by writing a book. Like that would be enough. It's a good tryout. The book is excellent. 12 points how to re-establish more or less your point of view and your direction in humanity, but it won't work. And the idea from that came actually from a very personal experience. I will share this now. It was something I felt at odd. I think some time ago I frequented a big religious festival in Greece, and I think Greece is still in the turning point. They still haven't become completely Newtonian. And I was so amazed that the whole village participated in the religious activity, which for a Swede was amazing, 99%. And then somebody had to mention, it wasn't me, that there were actually a villager who were an atheist with the odd name of Archangel. That was actually his name. All the others said no. Everyone believes. It was very important that every single one believed. And that is the revolution. It's enough with a few ones to shatter the whole classical system, because it's based on others, and therefore inherently, in a way, not as stable. What this shows, there is a much greater stability possible, a stability that cannot be shattered. In this case, it doesn't really matter if millions of people have an opposing view, because it's not based on a shared pre-reflective notion. This is in some way, I don't like to use the word truer, but experiential, more experiential. You can really experience this much more than the three dimensions of Newtonian classical physics. And here I'm actually quoting more or less Julian Barber, who says, problem, with Newtonian classical physics is not that it's tangible and observable, it's lack of observation and experience. That is the problem. And this is what boggered, sorry to use the word buggered, but it's a common word enough these days. This is what boggered Julian Barber when he went into the Bavarian Alps in the 60s, and he realized some sort of falsehood had entered, and this didn't feel good. It wasn't based on an experience. Stephen M Rosen is proposing nothing but a complete rejuvenation, and that will actually take us even into more stability than the one we had with the Greeks, even more so, because this is a true up, this is a true up, this is a true down, although it's both up and down at the same time. This is a non-localizable area. Up and down is exactly the same thing and are opposite still. I think we end here. It was great, and a new name came to the fourth. Actually, I wasn't able yesterday to read so far, so I could get into Burroughs, but it could be nice because he sounds a bit like Richard E. Lynn, but he's taking it even further. Like he bodily recognized that the eyes and tension around the eyes is what creates it, because it is with the eyes and with the vision verbs it's all started. This is where the object is at its very height, like distance from us. I see the object. I did wonder, actually, did Ian McKilchrist, why this absolute fixation with seeing things to tell what you are seeing. How often is that necessary? I would say in a real situation very seldom. It's something like, did you see that spot on my shirt? It is very forehanded in a way, but using that verbal phrase too often, it puts you into a weird situation. Puts you in a situation that you think I share with Kalle and this guy here, an outside world that can be seen and somehow needs to be seen all the time, to enable it to exist. Do you get my grip? For its existence to be there, it needs to be seen all the time. And therefore, the opposite, people who says, why? Things must exist even if they're not observed. They seem to be into the same thing. Observance seems to be really important. Whereas the quantum observation is not visual, it's experiential. You can let the superposition collapse even if you're blind. You need a sensing body, you need proprioception, but you don't need seeing as such. Very interesting. It was extremely pleasant lecture. Thank you very much for participating. Once more, I'm sorry for the disturbances early on, but now it seems actually they left, so that will not happen again. I had a very silent prayer actually, and I think that worked. God bless, and thank you very much.
Thank you.